3, 2, 1. Boosters in ignition. And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together back to the moon and beyond.
Roaring off Launch Pad 39B at the Kennedy Space Center, the next chapter in America's love affair with all things space.
All 4 RS-25 engines on the core stage and 2 solid rocket boosters now propelling the vehicle at 128 miles per hour.
NASA's Artemis rocket, the most powerful ever built, headed for a multi-day uncrewed orbit around the moon. A test flight before astronauts, including a woman and person of color, climb inside the Orion spaceship and eventually head for a lunar landing, perhaps within 2 to 5 years. Flanked with 2 booster rockets, Artemis looks like Apollo on steroids. 15% more powerful than the monster Saturn V rockets that carried Apollo astronauts to the moon.
There's a lot out there to explore, and this is the next beginning, and this is the Artemis generation.
Artemis is all about asserting America's leadership in space, building a lunar base and orbiting lunar space station. Then, in the late 2030s, a mission to Mars.
The moon is a few days away. Mars is months away unless we can develop new propulsion that can take us faster. And that's what we're going to have to do to figure out how we keep humans alive going millions and millions of miles and then bring them back alive and have all of the supplies that you need.
Artemis is the twin Greek god of Apollo with perfect aim.
The Apollo crew.
And NASA is building heavily on the lessons learned from Apollo, the tragedies and the triumphs.
Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
As it aims for a permanent return to the moon.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
A lot's changed since July 1969 when this mission control room put Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon. Back then, it was all about human exploration, innovation, technology, learning what's beyond the Earth. 50-plus years later, it is now also about a strategic and national security imperative. As NASA heads for the moon and Mars, a geostrategic chess game is today playing out just 200 miles above the Earth, where one wrong move could take out an entire constellation of satellites upon which the global economy and our GPS systems all depend. Joint Chiefs Chairman Mark Milley in November 2022 with a stark warning.
We're in the middle of one of the most fundamental changes in the character of war in the history of mankind.
And talk of war extends into space. The space race is no longer a race between just the U.S. and Russia. China has leapfrogged Russia, launching more rockets than the U.S. in 2022, completing its own orbiting space station, landing robotic missions on the far side of the moon.
That country that adapts the fastest, that country that innovates the most, that country is going to have a decisive advantage at the beginning of a war, which I suspect will happen at some point in time, sometime in the deep future.
Let's go into space because it's in our DNA.
Neil deGrasse Tyson is America's best-known astrophysicist.
The U.S. and China seem to be engaged in a new race to the lunar surface. How do you see this playing out?
We kind of already been there, all right? So in that sense, it's not a race. However, right now, we don't have the capacity to send humans back. Not yet. And so it's a race that isn't being run anymore. I think American pride, if China gets there before us, even for a second time, I think that might bruise us a little. And maybe we'll redouble and say, okay, you take the moon, we're going to Mars. If that redoubles that, by the way, that would be a geopolitical decision. Sure, go for it.
Military conflict on the ground is only fueling the tension in space. In Asia, as China tries to intimidate both Taiwan and its superpower rival, the U.S. In Ukraine, where the Cold War has turned hot, with high-flying drones shadowing and targeting Russian tanks and troops. And U.S.-provided HIMARS rocket artillery proving especially lethal at reaching deep behind Russian lines in Ukraine to take out artillery and command bunkers and turning the war in Ukraine's favor.
This is the U.S. Spacecom Jock with an Operation Olympic Defender Conference.
Using infrared satellites, every rocket and missile launch anywhere in the world is immediately tracked here.
Missile warning officer, brief situation.
This is the missile warning officer. At a time of 0938 Zulu.
At the U.S. Space Command Joint Operations Center in Colorado Springs.
It's at the zenith, the very top of our space operations centers within the Department of Defense.
Our cameras were the first ever allowed inside. Lieutenant General John Shaw is the deputy commander.
How quickly do they learn that something has launched somewhere in the world?
We have some really good space capabilities today that will tell us almost immediately if there's been a launch.
So the next meeting.
At the Pentagon, four-star Space Force General David Thompson says Russia continues to jam the GPS signal on the ground in Ukraine. The same signal provided by the constellation of 30 orbiting GPS satellites that the U.S. provides to the world for free.
It's that localized ability to jam the signal so that local receivers can't receive the information.
Ukrainians unable to access GPS because it's being jammed locally on the ground.
That's right. Ukrainians may not be able to use GPS because there are jammers around that prevent them from receiving and using the signal effectively.
As the war progressed in the spring of 2022, European airlines, including Finnair, accused Russia of jamming the GPS signals along its border with Finland that civilian airlines rely on. U.S. military sources also claim Russia has launched cyber attacks against the SpaceX Starlink satellites over Ukraine that provide the country with internet access, though the U.S. military says SpaceX engineers were able to defend against the attack by rewriting several lines of computer code.
I think a lot of us expected at the start of the Ukraine conflict that everything would go lights out and the Ukrainians would be locked out from the rest of the world. But what Starlink's shown is that they could continue to have access to the internet no matter what was happening terrestrially, and I think it's causing the Russians a little bit of discomfort.
While Russia, China, and Europe all have their own GPS satellite networks, most of the world, including Ukraine and the global economy, still depend on the U.S. GPS network provided by the U.S. military. Major Lauren Taylor directs the operations here.
How accurate is the U.S. system?
Within a foot and a half guaranteed.
A foot and a half?
Yes, sir.
From suburban drivers to international shipping, to farming, to banking, to disaster response, to U.S. and allied military forces on the ground.
Each satellite actually broadcasts multiple signals, so the civilians get their signal, the military gets their signal.
Interestingly, the Russians and the Chinese can use our GPS satellites as well.
I bet you they do.
They do.
GPS receivers have been found taped to the dashboards of downed Russian Su-34s, so the pilots know where they are due to the poor quality of their own systems.
Russian ground and air forces have been seen taping American GPS receivers to their tanks and cockpits.
Almost none of their vehicles contain situational awareness and digital battle management. Vehicles are frequently found with 1980s paper maps of Ukraine in them.
British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace says it underscores tremendous Russian vulnerability.
The result is that whilst Russia have large amounts of artillery and armour, which they like parading, they are unable to leverage them for combined arms manoeuvre and just resort to mass indiscriminate barrages.
Under U.S. law, the GPS system cannot be turned off to anyone. But military commanders say what's happening in orbit may now be even more concerning. When we come back, accusations that Russia and China have already placed weapons in space. October 5th, 2022.
Stage 1 propulsion is nominal.
Yet again, a perfect blue sky launch with SpaceX carrying its 5th crew to the International Space Station.
The crew is already pulling over 2 Gs.
On board, Commander Nicole Mann, Navy pilot Josh Casada, Japanese astronaut Koichi Wakata, and Russian cosmonaut Anna Kakina. The first Russian on a U.S. spacecraft in 20 years. The timing could not have been more poignant. Coming in the middle of the Ukraine war, with Russia hinting at a nuclear threat. But through it all, the crew continued training together in Houston and simply did not talk about international politics.
We were focusing on our common, unique, single aim. And we had not a time for something else.
The reason is simple. On station, their lives depend on each other.
It's like body systems to watch each other, and the second, to help each other, to assist each other in different tasks.
But as Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, the Russian cosmonauts on the station flew a Soviet flag, then the flags of the Ukrainian regions under Russian control. As the West imposed a high-tech embargo on Russia, the head of the Russian Space Agency, Dmitry Rogozin, said Russia would soon leave the station and build its own. The International Space Station partnership seemed in danger. Then suddenly, in the summer of 22, Rogozin was replaced. And the head of Russia's human spaceflight program, a former cosmonaut highly respected at NASA, suddenly changed course. How committed is Russia to this international cooperation, to the space station, and how long will you be a partner with the United States, with Japan, with Canada, with the international partners in this program?
We start to cooperate, as I said, many years ago, more than 40 years ago, and we will continue our cooperation as long as I can imagine.
That was a bombshell. Russia saying it will continue to cooperate.
I wonder if it's part of a concerted effort to ease the tensions and to turn down the temperature a bit.
Answer is yes.
The answer, he said, is yes.
We understand that it makes sense to keep flying because this excellent infrastructure that built in space can be used for humanity.
Off camera, Krikalev said he's not speaking for the Kremlin. But most experts believe Russia would not be able to build its own station should it leave the ISS, which NASA now hopes to keep flying through 2030.
Can we continue this relationship with Russia on the ISS indefinitely, or at least until 2031?
That is what is amazing. In the civilian space program, we can have this professional relationship that goes on without a hitch between Russians and American space flyers, while on the face of the earth, the leader of Russia is doing an unconscionable invasion of another sovereign country. It's incredible.
But the space station's science mission is very different from the military operations already underway in space.
0, ignition. Liftoff of L-87. Go Falcon, go, go.
February 2nd, 2022 in California, SpaceX launched a classified government satellite into orbit, NROL-87.
Stage separation confirmed.
Believed to be a top-secret, state-of-the-art spy satellite that the Pentagon says will support its overhead reconnaissance mission. Within months, Russia launched its own spy satellite, Cosmo 2558, placing it in the same orbit and just beneath the U.S. satellite.
That's really irresponsible behavior.
In an exclusive interview, Space Command 4-star General James Dickinson said Russia may be trying to get an up-close look at U.S. spy capabilities.
We see that it's in a similar orbit to one of our high-value assets for the U.S. government. And so we'll continue, like we always do, to continue to update that and track that and characterize that.
Longitude 80 degrees, 36 minutes west.
The U.S. uses its spy satellites to monitor what its adversaries are doing.
This is the newest infrared satellite used to detect the heat signatures from any missile or rocket launch anywhere in the world. This is half scale. The real satellite is about the size of a school bus.
On this day, closely watching both Taiwan and Ukraine.
We're watching pretty much any part of the world that we need to be watching from a national security perspective. And we're capable of watching any part of the globe.
International satellite experts say it was no coincidence that Russia launched its rocket at the very moment the U.S. spy satellite passed over the Russian launch site. Marco Landbroek tracks satellite movements from the Netherlands.
There is a part of the current new Cold War is also going on in space. So it's basically part of this cat and mouse game that's going on in space.
Line down.
Keeping watch over America's military and spy satellites is the top priority at this classified Space Force Ops Center.
More than 70% of military satellite communications come through here. Everything from nuclear command and control orders to presidential communications, down to a Coast Guard cutter, a submarine, even tactical units on the ground. How vulnerable are American satellites? The U.S. says both Russia and China have intentionally demonstrated offensive military capabilities in space, targeting and destroying their own satellites, scattering thousands of pieces of debris across low Earth orbit, posing a risk to other satellites and forcing the space station to adjust its position to avoid getting hit.
Indeed, the space station was threatened, which, by the way, not only have astronauts, it has cosmonauts on it.
The U.S. says when it conducted a similar test in 1985, it was at a low altitude.
Here's the difference. The China satellite that they took out was high enough in orbit so that all those pieces are still there, creating a debris catastrophe. If you take out a satellite in low Earth orbit, the air molecules, the trace air molecules that are there, they'll slow it down and they'll take it out of orbit in due time, so that the low Earth orbit debris has a self-cleaning mechanism. High up, it does not. And so it was, in that sense, irresponsible to do this, because now, forgive the reference, but it's like, peeing in the pool. We all swimming in the same pool.
The Pentagon says Russia has also deployed a nesting satellite that carries an offensive weapon, which it has already used to test fire a missile or a bullet very close to a top-secret American spy satellite.
They launched a satellite. They launched it into an orbit very close to one of our sensitive national security satellites. They maneuvered around that satellite in what we would call a hazardous and an unsafe and unprofessional manner. Then they backed that satellite off. What they did is that they then released a target. So the satellite had a target. They released that target. I would just call it a bullet, basically. It was a projectile. They just fired, I'll call it a bullet, from one satellite to the other. And the Russians knew very well that we could observe this. They were also making a very clear statement to us about their intention to threaten our capabilities.
And China has deployed a satellite with a robotic arm and claw that can reach out and grab or damage other satellites. The Pentagon says China's space program is now outpacing the U.S. with more than 60 launches in 2022, building a remote robotic post on the far side of the moon, invisible to U.S. satellites. The concern? Beijing could one day deploy offensive weapons in the space between the moon and Earth, an area called cislunar.
Because all of the activity that's happening on the moon has to go through cislunar space. So the ability to have a spacecraft in the cislunar domain enables the U.S. the first mover advantage for owning the cislunar environment.
In the coming years, the U.S. is preparing to launch a satellite into cislunar to monitor Chinese activity. In 2022, a Colorado company placed a small satellite called Capstone into cislunar to survey the best orbit for a future space station called Gateway that will orbit the moon.
This is Capstone, the actual size. It's about 50 pounds or so. It has these deployable solar panels. The key to this is the antenna on top, which transmits and connects directly with an orbiting NASA satellite.
What we're creating is a GPS at the moon that is expandable to effectively become the foundation for what the internet at the moon of the future might look like.
And Capstone is also helping the U.S. gain the high ground with eyes on that cislunar space.
You're not running a spy satellite necessarily, but can you see some Chinese satellite activity already?
All the underlying capabilities that we have to fly a satellite at the moon allows us to also take other data and track other satellites at the moon, whether they be NASA or other countries.
And what have you already seen?
We detected and optically tracked a satellite from China that was returning to the moon late last year.
On Earth, there are clear rules of the sea laid out over centuries. Like this incident in 2020 when a Russian warship threatened to ram a U.S. destroyer in a rare naval standoff in the Sea of Japan. Russia claimed the U.S. operated illegally in its territorial waters. The U.S. Navy says the U.S. was operating in international waters. But there are very few rules in space.
How do you determine what is a hostile act in space?
We're working through that now. We don't have that history like we do in the other domains to build upon. And so as we're encountering these threatening activities for the first time, it's forcing us to really define these terms.
When we come back, China's ambitions to play a dominant role in space, on the moon, and beyond. It's a climactic scene in Apple TV's For All Mankind, a shootout on the moon between American and Russian troops. A Hollywood thriller, but the current head of NASA warns there is a real threat, and Russia is not America's primary space adversary.
Our future space race is with China. And that is to be determined.
What is your concern about China's stated goals on the moon and in space and in cislunar?
They are very secretive. There is no openness at all to their space program. They do not want to cooperate. And it's primarily a military program as well as a civilian. Now, they will tell you that that's not true, but in fact it is true.
Chinese President Xi Jinping has talked for years about transforming China into a leading space power by 2045. Military and civilian space experts caution China is now outpacing the U.S. in launches and modernizing its own space capabilities, completing its own orbiting space station, building a remote robotic post on the far side of the moon, now invisible to U.S. satellites, and deploying offensive satellite weapons. But does the U.S. also have satellite-based weapons? U.S. commanders won't say.
Well, I think we have options on the table, but I would prefer not to get into those right now. I don't think I want to tell you what we have and what we don't have.
Does the United States have offensive capabilities in space already?
Yeah, so I'm not going to talk about what capabilities we may have or not have. I will definitely say that what the Chinese and the Russians have done are irresponsible and frankly, do not help in terms of use of the domain.
But many in the military and Congress believe it's time to declassify some of America's offensive capabilities in space.
I also would like for our adversaries to know what we can do. There are some things that we can do that I think would help chill their enthusiasm for aggression if they knew more about our capabilities.
ASAT launch from Greek Whiskey Charlie 6. How copy? Copy. ASAT launch. Initiating jet reaction.
For decades, the U.S. Air Force and its Space Command have been responsible for launching America's spy and military satellites. Then, in 2019, with more countries competing in low Earth orbit, the White House and Congress consolidated those responsibilities under a brand new Space Force.
American leadership in space is more important than it ever has been. Very exciting.
Signed into law by President Trump with a Delta symbol borrowed from the earliest days of the Air Force.
Check forces.
Both military and civilian leaders say it's a response to a very real threat. As the Navy has sailors and the Army has soldiers, Space Force today has Guardians, a force of just 14,000 now, with many of the senior officers holding STEM-related master's degrees and PhDs, problem-solving high-tech issues orbiting 220 miles and more above the Earth.
Like it or not, the reality is the battlefield is changing from planet Earth to space. This is the view of the Asian-Pacific theater. And the threat matrix in space is very different. It's congested, it's contested, and it's competitive.
They make our North warning system look like a picket fence.
Underscoring the evolving threat, the commanding general of NORAD warned in 2022 that America has a, quote, picket fence as a defense against Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles.
And while we were focused on violent extremists for the last 20-plus years, they were developing capabilities to hold our homeland at risk. About 3 to 4 years ago, Russia fielded the first hypersonic glide vehicle sitting on top of an ICBM that's nuclear capable. It's been out there for 4 years, operational with the United States of America and North America in its sights.
Meanwhile, just as Russian and U.S. submarines shadow each other in the oceans, a similar game is playing out in space. But how should the U.S. respond with Russia and China testing offensive weapons in space, blowing up their own satellites? In December 2021, astronauts and cosmonauts on the space station had to shelter in an escape capsule in case the station was hit by debris from the Russian test. The fear? Each exploding satellite could take out another 10 satellites, and each of those another 10, quickly cascading and wiping out the very satellites the world's economies depend on.
These tests, to be sure, are reckless, and they are irresponsible.
In December 22, the UN General Assembly voted to ban anti-satellite tests after Vice President Harris called for a global moratorium. China and Russia voted no.
Simply put, these tests are dangerous, and we will not conduct them.
That was just silly. It's going to happen.
Republican Mike Rogers is the ranking member on the House Armed Services Committee.
China and Russia couldn't care less what our stated policy is with regard to things like that. We need to be working on real policy that provides defensive capabilities to protect our satellites from their offensive endeavors.
Space Force commanders say all U.S. satellites, military and commercial, are already targeted by Russia and China with cyber probes, signal jamming, and laser dazzling. The hope, the more satellites that the U.S. puts into orbit, the less effective a single attack would be.
I'm of the opinion that as long as the United States continues on its path of owning the space domain and creating technologies that help us to maintain a commercial edge, I don't think a conflict will happen.
Military commanders worry China could one day deploy satellites to cislunar, that vast area of space between the moon and Earth.
The Air Force Research Laboratory is...
In response, the Air and Space Force's Research Lab is planning to launch its own satellites to monitor cislunar. And borrowing a name from a 1970s TV show.
The Cislunar Highway Patrol System, or CHIPS, will bypass thousands of government and commercial satellites as it makes its way to a rarely before visited domain, 272,000 miles from Earth, as NASA and numerous commercial companies look to extend our presence beyond the International Space Station to the lunar surface and interplanetary destinations.
Are you concerned about what is the increased military presence in space, whether it's Space Force, whether it's anti-satellite tests, whether it's China's alleged ambitions for the moon? Are you concerned about that?
Space has been a military asset from the beginning. So to say all of a sudden there's a space military activity, no. This has been going on continually. The existence of the Space Force really is this, it's an entity that was just simply behind the curtains of the U.S. Air Force.
It's been there all along.
It's been there all along. And they just said, let's part the curtains, pull it out. Oh, Mike, so you were there and you put up the GPS satellites? The GPS is a military project for navigation.
Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
More than 50 years since Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin first landed on the moon in 1969.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
A 1967 treaty signed by 111 countries, including the U.S., is still in effect, encouraging the peaceful exploration of space and prohibiting military bases on the moon or in space, testing nuclear weapons, and conducting military maneuvers. But the UN treaty does not prohibit non-nuclear weapons.
If you read that treaty, it's very beautiful. I mean, think about it. In the 1960s, there's still the Cold War and the Hot War, but we have hope that the future of the world could be something better than whatever we were creating in that moment. And when I first read that, I said, oh, that's beautiful, that's beautiful. And then as I got older, a little more cynical, I said, wait a minute. You think that just because you transport humans from Earth's surface where we're killing each other into space, that all of a sudden we're going to behave completely differently, then you don't understand humans. By the way, I'll believe it if you could demonstrate you could do it on Earth. And by the way, if you can do it in space, why not do it on Earth? Show me. Why should space be any different? By the way, Earth is in space. Last I checked. Okay? I'm screaming at you here, but you're getting me riled.
Charlie Bolden was a Marine Corps pilot, a general, and an astronaut before becoming the head of NASA under President Obama.
We can't have open warfare. We've got to discipline ourselves so that we don't make this potential warfighting domain a real warfighting domain. Or a lot of these dreams that we have about exploration and humanity going to places beyond low Earth orbit, they're never going to become true.
When we come back, Space Force isn't just responsible for protecting U.S. satellites and operations in space. It's also charged with protecting the planet from Armageddon. The return to the moon is only the beginning of human exploration of one of the last frontiers. Deep space has been on the drawing board for both NASA and the commercial space companies for decades. The next great race may very well be to the Martian surface.
Let's talk about where we are right now with the space race. It feels like we are on the cusp of something big, whether it's the moon, whether it's Mars, whether it's SpaceX. How do you really kind of gauge where we are right now in this whole space endeavor?
Well, I think the entrepreneur commercial participation in this quest to access space should have been happening decades ago. Maybe as early as the 1990s, we should have had private tourism already stoked.
And you're talking about space tourism. What about going to Mars? Elon Musk is determined, he says, to put humans on Mars. Does that make sense? Are you looking for Elon? He's not there.
No. Sorry. My read of history tells me that we or any civilization doesn't do expensive, dangerous things unless there's some really significant driver for it. It's never, let's do it because it's the next natural thing to do. Or let's go into space because it's in our DNA. Or let's explore because we're Americans and we move a frontier. That has never driven anything in the history of civilization. But you know what has? Fear of dying, the war driver. You know what else? The desire to get rich, the money driver. Without those two drivers operating in full force, either together or independently, I don't see it happening.
You don't see this happening in the near term?
Correct, unless there's a geopolitical force operating, such as what happened with Sputnik.
A man-made celestial body for the first time in history overcame terrestrial gravity and flew into space.
Okay, what would that be? China says they just have to leak a memo. It doesn't even have to be true. Leak a memo saying they want to put military bases on Mars. We're there in 12 months. 3 months to fund, design, build the spaceship, 9 months to take it there.
But you have said you are concerned about the intersection between the military-industrial complex and NASA and space engineers and scientists, right?
There is a two-way street between discoveries made in the military that could benefit NASA and scientists and discoveries made by scientists that could benefit the military. When you read the history of science and war, the relationship between physicists and warfare has been well known because they make weapons or they know how to make the weapon, especially in the nuclear era.
Which leads us to the current next frontier, that area of space between the Earth and the Moon, an area called cislunar.
So, given the fact that space is our backyard and the United States is very concerned about what's happening in cislunar, as well as on the dark side of the moon, far side of the moon, I corrected myself.
Side.
Yeah, I
very
know.
good.
That was a good album.
All sides of the moon receive sunlight.
That's right.
There is no dark side of the moon. But the history of this exercise on Earth says the person who gets control of a region then gets to make the rules in their own interest, whether or not it's in the interest of others.
The argument then is, if you're the U.S., you'd like to be the one that controls the rules.
Yeah, so another way to say it is, if China controls cislunar space and we need permission to get to the moon and pay a toll or whatever, it's not clear how much we would take kindly to that. That's correct.
You know, we all want to be optimistic about space.
Captain's log, stardate 1709.
I mean, you grew up watching Star Trek, so did I. You grew up, idolizing Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. Was that a little bit idealistic? Are we just headed for something that is a reality in space that none of us really wants?
I think you need the peaceful ideology to be in the dialogue. Otherwise, there's no hope of it ever achieving that. You still need to believe that the better sides of us all,
Lincoln's better angels,
will one day, the better angels of our fates, will somehow, if not be the destination, influence the unfolding of geopolitics en route. And because without it, it's a Wild West.
But it sounds like right now you're skeptical and you're concerned.
I'm a realist in that sense. And I care about all of humanity. As a scientist, as a human, I'm just saying maybe more people need to go into orbit and have a look at Earth from space. And you realize it does not look like the schoolroom globe that you were trained on from your earliest memories. The schoolroom globe, color-coded countries. Why? Why is that the first image of Earth they're giving me? Oh, it's to find out who your enemies are and who your friends are and who you're going to fight, who you did fight, who you might fight tomorrow. That's my first impression they're giving me of this beautiful planet Earth. And you go into space and you see it as nature intends you to see it, with oceans and land and clouds. Not a hint of a national border to be found.
Coming up, the new defense against a planet-killing asteroid and a new mission for America's Space Force.
2, 1. Oh my gosh. Oh wow.
Traveling at 14,000 miles per hour, NASA's DART spacecraft in time-lapse. Its final seconds before slamming into a harmless asteroid named Dimorphos, orbiting a bigger asteroid 7 million miles away. In typical NASA precision, bullseye.
Fantastic.
Then photographic proof that DART worked. That exploding cloud of dirt and rock, the moment the refrigerator-sized spacecraft crashed into Dimorphos, giving it a big shove, dramatically shortening its orbit even more than NASA had hoped.
It was expected to be a huge success if it only slowed the orbit by about 10 minutes, but it actually slowed it by 32 minutes.
A critical test if NASA hopes to use that same technique to one day divert a mega asteroid from hitting Earth.
There's a comet headed directly towards Earth.
A nightmare scenario played out in Hollywood mega hits.
This comet is what we call a planet killer.
But potentially a real-life threat to the global population. NASA Chief Bill Nelson.
And it may be the clue of what we could do in the future to try to save life here on Earth.
NASA says it does not see any asteroid posing an immediate threat to Earth, but in 2013, a massive meteor escaped detection and exploded over a remote Russian village, injuring some 1,500 people.
Impacts from asteroids have had a profound effect on the history of life on Earth. You can ask the dinosaurs about that.
66 million years ago, an asteroid nearly a mile wide made it through the atmosphere, striking Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, wiping out most of the dinosaurs, much of the Earth's plants and animals, and triggering a massive tsunami with waves more than a mile high. Preventing a future meteor strike will require advance notice, a lot of notice.
It's very reliable that NASA and other space agencies can have decades of warning time, can track these things reliably for 100+ years.
With enough warning, scientists hope a DART-type nudge will be less risky than using a nuclear missile to target an inbound planet killer, but potentially creating a massive debris field. Part of the charge to America's new Space Force, partnering with NASA to detect and respond to just such a threat.
As they're looking out to deep space, trying to understand what is going on out there, perhaps looking for asteroids that could be a potential hazard to the Earth, we may have some capabilities that we can actually bring to bear to assist them.
And asteroids themselves may be rich in minerals.
They're metallic asteroids that contain more gold than have ever been mined in the history of the world, and other sort of platinum group elements that are valuable to our modern tech economy. So who owns asteroids? These are interesting legal frontier questions. So when you're going into space, it's not just the scientists, engineers, and the politicians. There are the ethicists. There's the frontier of space law needs to consider all of this, so that I would hope that as we move into space, as space becomes our backyard, that we know how to behave in ways that are for the greater good of us all.
NASA is all about the greater good. The new James Webb Telescope, 1 million miles from Earth, uses high-resolution infrared technology to view distant stars and black holes that existed hundreds, even thousands of light years ago. Meanwhile, America's future Artemis missions will carry astronauts to the lunar surface in 2025 at the earliest, 4 astronauts in the spaceship Orion. A much more comfortable ride than 50 years ago.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
Just like Apollo, the astronauts on Orion will lift off on their backs, but there's 30% more room inside Orion than Apollo, which means there's room for 4 astronauts instead of 3. Now, right over there is a retractable rowing machine for exercise, and right there is a commode.
NASA is also testing out this new suit for future missions, replacing the suits worn by shuttle astronauts. The new suit, designed to keep astronauts alive for 144 hours should their spaceship lose cabin pressure.
You can see there's a little feed port here where, using a specialized bag design, we can put liquid nutrition in, think of like a protein shake, in there, and the crew member can turn their head in the helmet, be able to drink that so they have the proper nutrition.
How is it in there? Is it hot?
It feels good, nice and cool, sir.
Cool.
Yes, sir. I have a cooling garment underneath. It has a tube that goes from left to right all the way across that keeps me nice and cool.
Even on a hot Houston day.
Yes, sir.
I can bounce gently in this spacesuit and not very unlike what I can do on Earth.
At NASA's training pool, engineers and divers are already testing new suit designs for future moonwalks, covering the pool bottom with sand and rock to recreate lunar conditions, even planting the American flag.
This is very similar to what the Apollo astronauts did in preparation for their missions to the moon.
They've got to try to replicate what it's like on the south pole of the moon, where the sun is very low, right in your eyesight, but everywhere else, it's pitch black.
NASA believes there's water ice on the South Pole, a potential source of drinking water and rocket fuel. But it's colder with less sunlight. Lisa Shore is the deputy chief of the pool lab.
So you're going to have this kind of dusk lighting, and then behind any kind of large rock or things like that, you'll have this long shadow where it's just going to be very dark.
It certainly is easier to drive when you're in the sunlight.
Absolutely.
Those shadows are so long.
Already, astronauts are using simulators to practice driving a rover on the moon.
So astronauts need to learn how to drive a rover without going into one of these holes and craters.
That's correct. You very often don't know how deep these craters are. It's difficult to tell how big these rocks are. So you have about 18 inches of clearance on your reference vehicle here. There are rocks that you cannot drive over.
NASA has promised the first astronauts to land on the moon will include a woman and a person of color.
Since I've been up here on orbit,
Captain Victor Glover went to the space station on SpaceX Crew 1.
We have an astronaut corps that represents our country. And when we're in space, we represent all of humanity. So we look like the planet does, and that's important because it's the right thing to do.
By 2030, NASA hopes to have a lunar base. A new international space station called Gateway will orbit the moon, serving as a floating science base. Already, the future Gateway space station is coming together in Houston.
Eventually, 4 or 5 of these modules will be linked together, orbiting the moon, with crews spending, on average, 30 days on station.
There'll be 4 astronauts that'll come via Orion, come to Gateway. They'll come there, they'll get ready. 2 of them can then go down to the lunar surface for a mission on the lunar surface. About a 6.5 day for those first missions, while 2 of them stay on Gateway, doing research, doing activities on Gateway, and then the other 2 will come back.
NASA hopes to use Gateway and the lunar base to go even deeper into space with a crewed mission to Mars by the late 2030s. Picking up where the rovers Sojourner, Spirit, Opportunity, Curiosity, and Perseverance left off, looking for signs of ancient or even current microbial life. But that's decades away.
Orion is right on the money, coming right down the pike.
This is now.
Now you are seeing the Earth, you are seeing home, you are seeing yourself in that image right there.
NASA's Orion uncrewed spacecraft traveling 268,000 miles beyond Earth during its 25-day mission. A lunar flyover just 80 miles above the surface, sending back spectacular high-resolution images. Then 40,000 miles further into deep space and a stable orbit for a full shakedown.
And that gives all of our engineers, our flight controllers, the chance to really learn about Orion systems in deep space, learn about flying a spacecraft farther than we've ever sent one intended for humans. We're going beyond anywhere we ever went for Apollo.
Back to the moon for a slingshot return to Earth. The view looking out the Orion window.
This is the moment of truth for Orion.
As Orion screamed into the atmosphere at 32 times the speed of sound, its new protective shield hitting 5,000 degrees, half the temperature of the sun. To bleed off speed, NASA skipped the spaceship off the atmosphere before dipping back in and slowing from 25,000 miles per hour.
And there it is, high over the Pacific.
To a gentle landing 300 miles south of San Diego.
Splashdown. The latest chapter of NASA's journey to the moon comes to a close. Orion, back on Earth.
The entire mission picture perfect with NASA precision, exceeding the engineering expectations and setting the stage for the next human flights and a moon landing.
This time we go back to the moon to learn to live, to work, to invent, to create, in order to go on out into the cosmos to further explore.
America and its international partners may be poised to win the return race to the moon, with China close behind, perhaps by just a few years, and determined to stay, and then to Mars.
It is the beginning of the new beginning, and that is to explore the heavens.
A new field for the indomitable human spirit of exploration, innovation, cooperation, hoping to put aside and rise above the worst of human nature, a battlefield in space.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.